Stella Wilson was waiting for her husband to come home from work. She cleaned the room, closed the curtains, cooked supper, and lit up 2 table lamps. Every now and then, Stella Wilson would look at the clock. She wasn't worried. She just liked knowing that each minute brought her husband closer to coming home. She had a calm and happy demeanor, even when she was sewing clothes. Even though she was 6 months pregnant, her skin looked clear and wonderful. When the clock said 10 minutes to 8, she began to listen, and just on time, she heard the car tires on the gravel outside. The car door slamming, footsteps, and the key turning in the lock. She set aside her sewing, stood up, and walked over to hug him as he entered the room.
"Hello, darling,"
she said.
"Hello, darling,"
he replied. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and prepared the drinks, making a strong one for him and a weaker one for herself. Soon, she was back in her chair sewing, and he was in the other chair opposite her, holding the big glass with both hands. This was always a happy time of the day for her. She knew he didn't like talking much until he finished his first drink, and she was fine sitting quietly, happy to be with him after being alone in the house for hours. She loved being in his presence and feeling the warmth he brought when they were alone together. She loved him for how relaxed he looked in a chair, how he entered a room or moved gracefully across it with huge steps. She loved the focus in his eyes and his ability to remain silent about his tiredness, exhaustion, sitting calmly until the wine had taken some of it away.
"Feeling tired, darling?"
"Yes, I'm tired."
And as he spoke, he did something unexpected. He raised his glass and finished it in one gulp, even though there was still at least half of it left. Stella wasn't really watching him, but she knew what he had done because she heard the ice cubes falling against the empty glass when he lowered his arm. He paused for a moment, leaning forward in the chair. Then he stood up and walked slowly to get himself another drink.
"I'll get it,"
she cried, standing up.
"Sit down,"
he said. When he returned, she noticed that the new drink had a deep, violent color due to the amount of wine in it.
"Darling, shall I get your slippers?"
"No."
Stella watched him as he began to sip the dark purple drink. She could see the oily swirls in the liquid because it was so strong.
"I think it's a shame that when a policeman becomes as senior as you, they make him walk around on his feet all day long,"
she said. He didn't answer, so she lowered her head again and resumed sewing. But every time he lifted the drink to his lips, she heard the ice cubes falling against the glass.
"Darling, I made cheese pie for supper. Would you like me to get you some? I haven't made any dinner because it's Friday."
"No."
he replied.
"If you don't want to eat cheese pie, there's plenty of meat and other food in the freezer,"
she said. Stella looked at him, her eyes waiting for an answer, a smile or a small nod, but he remained silent.
"Anyway, I'll get you some mushrooms and sausages,"
she continued.
"No, I don't want it,"
he replied.
"But you should eat. I'll cook it anyway, and then you can decide whether to have it or not."
She stood up and placed her sewing machine on the table.
"Sit down. Just for a minute. Please sit down,"
he said. It was at that moment when she began to feel frightened.
"Sit down,"
he said again. Stella slowly sat onto the chair, watching him all the time with those large eyes. He had finished his second drink and was staring down into the glass, looking serious.
Listen, I need to tell you something,
he said.
What is it, darling? What's wrong?
He became completely still and kept his head down.
I'm afraid this might be a bit of shock to you, but I've thought about it a lot, and I've decided it's best to tell you now. I hope you won't be too upset with me.
And he told her. It didn't take long, perhaps 6 or 7 minutes at most. She sat still, watching him with a kind of shocked horror, feeling like he was drifting further and further away from her with each word.
So, that's the situation, and I know it's not the best time to tell you, but there was no other option. I'll give you money and make sure you're taken care of, but let's try to keep it quiet. It wouldn't be good for my job if there was a lot of fuss.
Her first reaction was disbelief, wanting to reject everything he had said. It occurred to her that perhaps he hadn't even spoken, that she herself had imagined the entire conversation. Stella thought that, if she kept on working and acted as if she hadn't heard anything, maybe later, when she felt more awake, she would find out that none of it had actually occurred.
I'll prepare dinner,
Stella whispered, and this time he didn't stop her. As she walked across the room, she felt like she couldn't even feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all except a desire to vomit. Everything was automatic now. Down the steps to the cellar, turning on the light switch, opening the deep freezer, and grabbing the first thing her hand touched. She took it out and looked at it. It was wrapped in paper, so she took off the paper and looked at it again. A leg of lamb. All right then, they would have lamb for dinner. She took it upstairs. As she passed through the living room, she saw her husband standing by the window with his back turned towards her. She stopped.
For heaven's sake, don't make dinner for me. I'm going out,
he said. At that moment, Stella walked up behind him without any hesitation and hit the large frozen leg of lamb on the back of his head. She took a step back, waiting. He stood there for 4 to 5 seconds until he collapsed onto the carpet. The sound of the crash brought her out of the shock. She came back to reality slowly, feeling cold and stunned. She stood there for a moment, blinking at the body, still holding the piece of meat tightly with both hands.
Okay, so I've killed him,
she told herself. It was remarkable how clear her mind became in that moment. She began thinking very fast. Being the wife of a detective, she knew very well what the consequences would be, but that didn't matter to her. In fact, it would be a relief. She was worried about the child. What were the laws regarding murderers who were pregnant? Did they kill both the mother and the unborn child? Or did they wait until the child was born? What did they do? Stella Wilson didn't know, and she didn't want to take any risks. She took the meat into the kitchen, put it in a pan, turned the oven to high, and placed it inside. Then she washed her hands and went upstairs to the bedroom. She fixed her hair, touched up her lips and face. She tried to smile, but it looked odd.
Hello, Scott.
She spoke aloud. Her voice sounded strange to her ears.
Scott, I'd like some carrots and tomatoes, please.
That was better. Both the smile and the voice were coming out better now. She practiced it several more times. Then she ran downstairs, took her coat, and went to the market. It wasn't 7 o'clock yet, and the lights were still on in the grocery shop.
Hello, Scott.
She said to the man behind the counter.
Good evening, Mrs. Wilson. How are you?
I'm fine. I'd like some carrots and tomatoes, please. Hello, Scott. I'd like some carrots and tomatoes, please. We usually go out on Fridays, you know. But George is tired and doesn't want to eat out tonight. And now, there are no vegetables in the house.
She told him.
Then how about meat, Mrs. Wilson?
No thanks, I've got meat. I got a nice leg of lamb from the freezer.
Oh,
I don't usually cook it frozen, Scott, but I'm giving to give it a try. Do you think it'll be okay?
personally, I don't think it makes any difference. Do you want cherry tomatoes?
The grocer asked.
Oh yes, half kg of them.
Anything else? How about dessert? What are you planning to give him for dessert?
Well, what do you suggest, Scott?
The man looked around his shop.
How about a big slice of blueberry cheesecake? I know he likes that.
Perfect. It's his favorite.
After everything was wrapped and she had paid, she said,
Thank you, Scott. Good night.
Good night, Mrs. Wilson. And thank you.
As she hurried back, she told herself that she was simply returning home to her husband, who was waiting for dinner. She needed to cook it well and make it as tasty as possible, since the poor man was tired. She was just going home with the vegetables. Mrs. George Wilson going home with the vegetables on Friday evening to cook dinner for her husband.
Do everything right and natural. Keep things absolutely natural, and there will be no need for acting,
she told herself. So she entered in her house smiling.
George? How are you, darling?
She called. She put the parcel on the table and went into the living room. When she saw him lying there on the floor, she froze. All the old love and longing for him welled up inside her, and she ran over to him, knelt down beside him, and began to cry her heart out. It came naturally. No acting was necessary. A few minutes later, she got up and called the police station.
Quick! Please come quickly. George is dead.
Who is this?
Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. George Wilson.
You mean George Wilson's dead?
I think so. He's lying on the floor, and I think he's dead.
We'll be right over,
the policeman said. The car arrived very quickly, and when she opened the front door, 2 policemen walked in. She knew them both. She knew almost everyone at that station. She went over to join the other one, named Albert, who was kneeling by the body.
Is George dead?
Stella cried.
I'm afraid he is. What happened?
She quickly told him story about going out to the grocer and coming back to find him on the floor. As she spoke, Sergeant Albert noticed some blood on the dead man's head. Soon, more people began to arrive at the house. First, a doctor came in, followed by 2 detectives. Later, a police photographer arrived to take pictures, and a man who knew about fingerprints also came in. The detectives kept asking her questions. She told her story again, starting from the beginning, when George had come in and she was sewing, how tired he was, and how he didn't want to go out for dinner. She told that she had put meat in the oven and then went out to the grocer for vegetables and returned to find him lying on the floor.
Which grocer?
One of the detectives asked. She told him, and he went outside onto the street. He came back in 20 minutes with a page of notes, and there was more whispering. Through her sobbing, she heard a few phrases like,
Acted quite normal, very joyful, wanted to give him a good dinner. Cheesecake, impossible that she...
After a while, the photographer and the doctor left, and 2 other men came in to take the body away on a stretcher. The 2 detectives stayed, along with the 2 policemen. They were very kind to her, and Albert asked if she would prefer to go somewhere else, maybe to her sister's house or to his own wife's place, where they would take care of her for the night.
No.
She said. She didn't want to go anywhere.
Shouldn't you lie down on the bed?
Albert asked.
No, I'd like to stay here in this chair. When I'll feel better, I'll move,
She said. So they left her and went to search the house. Albert told her that her husband had been killed by a blow to the back of the head, most likely with a heavy object. They were searching for the weapon. The murderer might have taken it with them, but it was also possible that they had thrown it away or hidden it somewhere in the property. The search went on. She was aware that there were policemen all around the house. It began to get late, nearly 10 o'clock. The 4 men searching the rooms looked tired.
Albert, would you mind getting me a drink?
She asked.
Of course, I'll get you a drink. You mean this wine?
Yes, please. But just a little. It might make me feel better.
He gave her the glass.
Why don't you have one yourself? You must be awfully tired. Please do. You've been very kind to me.
Well, it's not allowed, but I'll just have a drop to keep me going.
Albert replied. After drinking wine, he went into the kitchen. He quickly came out and said,
Mrs. Wilson, you know your oven is still on and the meat is still inside.
Oh dear. I completely forgot.
He exclaimed. She then went into the kitchen and turned off the oven. When she came back to the living room, she spoke to Sergeant Albert.
Well, you all are, trying to catch the person who killed George. You must be terribly hungry because it's long past your dinner time. I know George would never forgive me if I allowed you to stay in his house without offering you food. Why don't you eat up that lamb that's in the oven? It should be cooked by now.
Wouldn't dream of it.
Sergeant Albert said.
Please, please eat it. It would be a favor to me if you'd eat it up. Then you can go on with your work afterward.
The 4 policemen hesitated initially, but they were very hungry, and eventually they were persuaded to go into the kitchen and help themselves. Stella stayed where she was, listening to them talk among themselves.
Would you like some more, Patrick?
No, I shouldn't. I better not finish it.
She wants us to finish it. She said so.
All right then, give me some more.
The doctor says George's skull was smashed to pieces, just like from a sledgehammer.
That's why it should be easy to find. Whoever did it is not going to carry something like that with him.
I believe it's right here on this property.
Probably right under our very noses. What do you think, Albert?
And in the other room, Stella Wilson began to giggle.